Story 1. The Garden of Stone Eyes. In the idyllic suburb of Willow Creek, where tree-lined streets and cookie-cutter homes promised a life of tranquility, Ethan and Clara Harper arrived with their 3 children, Jimmy, Lila, and baby Noah, hoping to trade the suffocating clamor of their city apartment for a fresh start. The house they'd purchased was a charming 2-story colonial, its white clapboard facade glowing under the golden summer sun. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, a symbol of their hard-won stability. The backyard, however, was the true gem, a sprawling, untamed garden bursting with wild roses, tangled ivy, and a collection of ancient stone statues. Angels with outstretched wings, cherubs with cracked halos, and indistinct figures stood like silent guardians, their weathered surfaces lending an air of mystery. Clara, an artist with a love for the unconventional, was enchanted. "It's like a secret world," she murmured, tracing the moss-covered face of an angel. Ethan, a pragmatic accountant, saw only extra yard work but agreed to keep the statues, if only to see Clara's eyes light up. The first weeks were a blur of cardboard boxes, late-night pizza, and the chaos of settling a young family. Neighbors welcomed them with casseroles and tales of Willow Creek's charm, boasting of unlocked doors and annual block parties. The Harpers felt they'd found their haven, but as the summer heat settled into a sticky haze, Ethan began to notice something peculiar. From the kitchen window where he'd linger over his morning coffee, he'd catch glimpses of the garden. One statue, an angel with a serene, upturned face, seemed to shift. Initially, it faced the house, its stone eyes locked on the windows. But one morning, as the dawn painted the sky pink, Ethan froze, his mug halfway to his lips. The angel was turned away, its gaze fixed on the dense, shadowy woods that bordered their property. He blinked, telling himself he'd misremembered. Statues didn't move. They couldn't. Yet the unease took root. The next day, a cherub, its halo fractured, had turned as well, its back to the house. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stood at the window, the morning mist curling around the garden like ghostly fingers. He questioned Clara, who was juggling Noah's breakfast and Lila's crayons. She laughed, her voice light but strained. "You're imagining things, Ethan. It's just a garden." Their son Jimmy, an 8-year-old with a penchant for pranks, swore he hadn't touched the statues, his wide eyes convincing Ethan the boy was innocent. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He began inspecting the garden daily, his sneakers crunching on the gravel path as he studied each figure. The statues were massive, carved from solid granite, their bases sunk deep into the earth. Moving one would require a team, maybe machinery. Yet day by day, more turned, first a hooded figure, then a weeping maiden, until the entire garden seemed to be watching the woods, as if guarding against an unseen threat. Ethan's sleep grew fitful, plagued by dreams of stone eyes glowing in the dark. He'd wake, heart pounding, and peer out the bedroom window, half expecting to see the statues creeping closer. Clara noticed his tension, her own smiles growing forced. The kids, sensing the shift, clung to their parents, their laughter quieter. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the sky, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The statues were no longer scattered across the garden. They stood in a perfect, unnerving line, inches from the house's back wall, their faces tilted upward, staring directly at the second-floor windows. The sight was grotesque, like a silent army poised to breach their home. Clara, drawn by Ethan's gasp, clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is wrong." They called the police, who arrived with flashlights and skeptical frowns. The officers, led by a gruff sergeant named Callahan, suggested bored teenagers or a disgruntled former owner. They searched the property, their boots trampling the roses, but found no footprints, no signs of tampering. "Get some cameras," Callahan advised, his tone implying they were overreacting. Ethan nodded, but the cost gnawed at him. Their savings were already stretched thin by the mortgage and Noah's medical bills. That night, Clara locked every door and window, her hands shaking. Ethan sat up, a baseball bat by his side, listening to the house creak and settle. Days passed without incident, but the house no longer felt like a home. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the garden set Ethan's nerves on edge. Clara began researching the house's history, digging through county records and old newspapers. She found nothing unusual, just a string of owners, none staying longer than a few years. "Maybe it's just us," she said, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Ethan tried to reassure her, but he was unraveling too. He'd catch himself staring at the statues, convinced they'd moved an inch closer when he wasn't looking. Then, one Sunday morning, Ethan stepped into the backyard with Jimmy and Lila, planning a game of catch to lift their spirits. His eyes fell on the house's back wall, and his knees buckled. In bold black spray paint, the words "Go away" screamed across the brick, the letters jagged and uneven, as if scrawled in a frenzy. Lila gasped, and Jimmy's ball rolled forgotten into the grass. Ethan ushered the kids inside, his voice shaking as he told Clara to stay with them. Fueled by a mix of rage and terror, he tore through the garden, shouting into the empty air, his voice echoing off the trees. No one answered. The police returned, their report as useless as before, promising only to increase patrols. Callahan's parting words, "Probably just kids," rang hollow. That night, as Ethan washed dishes, a scream shattered the silence. Clara stood at the living room window, her hands pressed against the glass, her face drained of color. Ethan rushed to her side, and his stomach lurched. In the backyard, illuminated by the moon's cold light, 5 figures stood in a circle. Their faces were hidden behind white masks, featureless except for dark, hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. They moved in a jerky, unnatural dance, their limbs twitching like puppets on invisible strings. Ethan's mind raced. Cultists, lunatics, or something far worse. The children, drawn by the commotion, huddled behind Clara, their whimpers piercing the silence. Ethan grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands trembling, and ordered Clara to call the police. Against every instinct, he flung open the back door and charged outside, screaming threats into the night. The figures froze, their masked faces turning toward him in unison. For a moment, time stopped, the air thick with menace. Then as one, they scattered into the garden, their footsteps silent as they melted into the shadows. Ethan retreated, locking the door and guarding it until the police arrived. The search yielded nothing. No footprints, no masks, no trace of the intruders. Callahan's skepticism bordered on irritation, but he promised to station a patrol car nearby. The next day, Ethan drained their savings to install security cameras, their blinking red lights a feeble shield against the unknown. Clara begged to move, her voice breaking as she spoke of the kids' nightmares. Ethan, stubborn and desperate to protect their investment, promised they'd leave if one more thing happened. Weeks passed without incident, the cameras recording only squirrels and swaying branches, but the fear lingered, a constant weight on their shoulders. Clara stopped painting, her easel gathering dust. Jimmy refused to play outside, and Lila clung to her mother's side. Noah, too young to understand, seemed to sense the tension, his cries sharper than before. One night, as a storm rolled in, Ethan woke to a faint sound, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers on glass. He crept downstairs, the bat in his hand, and found the source, the kitchen window. Rain streaked the glass, but beyond it, a single statue. The angel stood inches from the pane, its face pressed against the window, its stone eyes gleaming in the lightning's flash. Ethan stumbled back, his scream lodged in his throat. He checked the cameras, but the footage showed nothing. No movement, no figure dragging the statue. The next morning, the angel was back in the garden, as if it had never moved. Clara's research uncovered a buried story. Decades ago, the land had been a private estate, its owner a reclusive sculptor obsessed with angels. Rumors swirled of strange rituals in the woods, of figures seen dancing under the moon. The estate was razed, the land subdivided, but the statues remained, buried and later unearthed by developers. The Harpers considered selling, but the market had crashed, trapping them in Willow Creek. They still live in the house, raising their children in a place that feels like a battlefield. The statues remain, their stone eyes watching, and Ethan can't shake the feeling that whatever haunted their garden is still out there, biding its time. Every night he checks the cameras, praying the angel stays in its place. Story 2. The locked room. Miles and Taylor Conway were wanderers at heart, their lives shaped by the open roads and quiet fields of rural America. When Taylor, weary of her family's suffocating presence, proposed a move far from their small-town roots, Miles saw it as a chance to rewrite their story. An electrician with a gift for fixing broken things, he could work anywhere. And Taylor, who'd left her job years ago, was ready for adventure. They chose a sprawling ranch house in the deserts of New Mexico, its adobe walls and red-tiled roof rising like a mirage against the endless horizon. The house was a bargain, its size almost comical for just the two of them and their black lab, Lola. "We'll make it ours," Taylor said, her voice bright with possibility. Miles, charmed by her enthusiasm, agreed, envisioning barbecues and starlit nights. The first months were a dream. They hiked the dusty trails snaking through their property, cooked chili on a campfire, and laughed as Lola chased jackrabbits across the sand. The house, with its high ceilings and sunlit rooms, felt like a canvas for their future. But as autumn crept in, bringing cooler nights and longer shadows, Miles noticed a glitch. The upstairs lights flickered, plunging bedrooms into darkness while the rest of the house stayed powered. As an electrician, he recognized a load imbalance, likely tied to the breaker in the basement. He hadn't spent much time down there. The realtor had given it a cursory glance during the tour, and Miles had no reason to linger. But one crisp afternoon, armed with a flashlight in his toolbox, he descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was a maze of clutter, old furniture draped in cobwebs, rusted tools, and crates of forgotten junk. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something sharper, almost metallic. A single bulb dangled overhead, casting jagged shadows across the concrete walls. Miles wove through the debris, his boots scuffing the floor, until he found the breaker panel. Its wires were a mess, a tangle of outdated engineering that made him wince. After pinpointing the issue, he jotted a mental note to rewire it later. As he turned to leave, curiosity tugged at him. This was his home, yet the basement felt like a foreign land. He began exploring, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. That's when he saw it, a massive metal door in the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of splintered chairs. It wasn't just a door, it was a fortress, industrial grade, reinforced with rivets, and towering nearly 8 feet. Miles's pulse quickened. A storm shelter, perhaps? New Mexico's tornadoes were rare but fierce. But why hadn't the realtor mentioned it? He gripped the handle, its cold steel biting his palm, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was solid, unyielding. Upstairs, he rummaged through a drawer of keys left by the previous owners, testing each one to no avail. Taylor, intrigued by the mystery, suggested they contact the sellers. After some digging, they reached the couple, but the call was unsettling. The wife's voice was clipped, her pauses long and heavy, as if weighing every word. "It's just a safe room," she said finally, "for tornadoes." When Miles asked about the key, she claimed they'd lost it and urged them to ignore it. The line went dead, leaving Miles with a sinking feeling. Taylor tried to laugh it off, but Miles couldn't let it go. The door haunted him, its presence a riddle he couldn't solve. Over the next few weeks, he found himself drawn to the basement, staring at the steel surface as if it might whisper its secrets. He tried picking the lock, using tricks from his trade, but it held fast. The mystery consumed him, and Taylor, sensing his obsession, grew uneasy. "It's just a door, Miles," she said, but her eyes darted nervously. Finally, at her urging, they hired a locksmith. The man arrived 2 days ago, his tools clinking as he descended into the basement. After an hour, he called Miles down, his face grim. "This lock's military grade," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not your standard panic room." But he'd cracked it, his tools coaxing the mechanism open with a heavy clunk. Miles pushed the door, the hinges groaning like a dying beast. The room beyond was a nightmare made real. The walls were plastered with black and white photographs, their subjects, men, women, children, obscured by strange hand-drawn symbols, spirals, crosses, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse in the dim light. A single chair sat in the center, facing a blank wall, its wood worn smooth as if someone had sat there for years, staring into nothingness. A cot in the corner held crumpled blankets, stained and sour. The air reeked of staleness, undercut by a faint, rancid sweetness. Worst of all was the trash. Empty chip bags, water bottles, candy wrappers, scattered like offerings. Someone had been living here, and recently. Miles's knees weakened. Then he saw it. A second door, small and tucked into the shadows, its edges rusted. He opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading to the cellar door outside, the one he'd never checked, assuming it led to the basement. The realization hit like a sledgehammer. Someone had been entering their home, moving through their lives, unseen. Memories flooded back, missing keys, a scarf, half-eaten snacks they'd blamed on each other. It wasn't carelessness, it was an intruder. The police arrived, their flashlights sweeping the room as they took a report. The realtor, horrified, promised to help, but the previous owners were unreachable, their number disconnected. Miles and Taylor scoured the house for clues, finding faint scratches on the cellar door's lock, as if someone had picked it repeatedly. That night, as they tried to sleep, a loud bang jolted them awake. Lola barked furiously, her hackles raised. The banging continued, now at the front door, followed by the sharp tap of rocks against their bedroom window. Miles grabbed a baseball bat, his anger outweighing his fear. He peered outside, but the desert was dark, the horizon swallowing any sign of life. Taylor begged him to call the police, but Miles hesitated, a primal urge to confront the intruder burning in his chest. Then came the crash of shattering glass. Miles sprinted downstairs, bat raised, to find the kitchen window in pieces, shards glinting on the floor. Two figures sprinted into the night, their silhouettes vanishing into the dunes. The police arrived swiftly, their search fruitless. They speculated the squatter, locked out of their hidden lair, had returned to intimidate them. The case was escalated, but the previous owners remained elusive. Miles barricaded the cellar door with furniture and chains, padlocking it shut. He installed motion sensors, their beeps a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Days later, a package arrived, unmarked, left on their porch. Inside was a single key, its surface etched with the same symbols from the room. Miles's hands shook as he held it, knowing it fit the door. He hasn't tried it yet, too afraid of what lies beyond. The police are still searching, but the desert keeps its secrets. Taylor barely sleeps, and Lola growls at shadows. Miles keeps the bat by his bed, the key hidden in a drawer. The house, once a dream, is a prison, and the door's shadow looms over every moment. Story 3. The Neighbor's Gaze. At 27, Lucas Bennett stood on the threshold of independence. His first home, a modest two-story fixer-upper in the quiet town of Elmwood. After years of saving, he'd escaped the raucous chaos of his parents' house, where siblings and dogs filled every corner with noise and life. The silence of his new home was a shock, the absence of footsteps and barking, leaving a void he wasn't sure he'd ever fill. But the house had its charms, a cozy fireplace, a creaky staircase, and a tiny second-floor balcony, barely wide enough for one person. Lucas took to standing there each evening, smoking and watching the sunset, the ritual anchoring him in his new reality. Elmwood was a quintessential suburban block, with houses pressed close, their backyards divided by tall wooden fences. From his balcony, Lucas could see into his neighbor's yard, a jungle of weeds and neglect. The house itself was a mystery, its windows dark, its lawn untamed. Unlike the neighbors who'd welcomed him with smiles and homemade pies, the occupant of the house behind his was invisible. No one answered the door, no one tended the garden, and the only sign of life was an occasional flicker of light at night. Lucas assumed an elderly recluse lived there, too frail or stubborn to maintain the property. Curiosity gnawed him. One Saturday, determined to break the ice, he walked around the block to the neighbor's house. Up close, it was worse than he'd imagined. Peeling paint, cracked siding, and a walkway stained with years of grime. The doorbell hung limp, its wires exposed, so Lucas knocked, the sound swallowed by the stillness. No answer. He was about to leave when he caught a faint movement behind the window shade, a shadow shifting as if someone was watching. His skin prickled. but he stood his ground, knocking again. Silence. Just as he turned to go, the door flew open with a violent bang, slamming against the wall like a gunshot. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her presence a storm of silent menace. She was short, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her skin etched with deep wrinkles that seemed to tighten as she stared. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an intensity that felt almost alive, as if they could peel back Lucas's skin. She didn't speak, just watched, her face a mask of tension. Lucas stammered an introduction, explaining he was her new neighbor. After a pause that stretched into eternity, she muttered, "Priscilla," her lips curling into a half-smile that didn't touch her eyes. Before he could respond, she stepped back, the door still open, as if daring him to follow. Lucas left, the encounter leaving a sour knot in his stomach. That night, as he stood on his balcony, he glanced into her yard and froze. Priscilla was there, standing dead center in the moonlight, staring up at his house. Her wide eyes gleamed, unblinking, as if she could see through the walls to where he stood. Lucas's breath caught, his cigarette trembling in his hand. He ducked inside, telling himself she was just eccentric, maybe senile. But the next night he saw her again, moving from window to window in her house, her gaze locked on him. He pretended not to notice, but her stare followed him, heavy and unrelenting. He checked again later, and she was still there, a sentinel in the dark. Lucas called his dad, a retired cop with a knack for calming his son's nerves. "Probably dementia," his dad said. "She's lonely, confused. Feel bad for her, Lucas." The explanation made sense, but it didn't ease the dread pulling in Lucas's gut. For a few nights, the yard stayed empty, and he dared to hope it was over. Then he found a woman's sock in his backyard, just over the fence. It was small, worn, and unmistakably hers. She'd been on his property, crossing the boundary between their worlds. His stomach churned, but he hesitated to confront her, not wanting to spark a feud with a neighbor. Days later, as Lucas worked on the house, sanding floors, painting walls, he noticed something else. His tools were misplaced, a hammer left on the porch, a screwdriver in the grass. Small things, easy to dismiss, but they added up. He began locking the doors, something he'd never done in Elmwood. One evening, as he smoked on the balcony, he caught a glimpse of movement in Priscilla's yard. She was digging, her frail arms working a shovel with unnatural strength. The hole was small but deliberate, as if she were burying something or unearthing it. Lucas's heart raced, but he couldn't look away. She paused, her head snapping up, and for a moment, their eyes met across the fence. She smiled, a slow, chilling curve of her lips, before returning to her task. That night, the doorbell rang, a rapid, insistent chime that tore through the house. It didn't stop, ringing over and over, each note a jab at his nerves. Lucas knew it was her. Fueled by frustration and a growing sense of violation, he threw on a shirt and stormed to the door, ready to demand she leave him alone. But as he yanked it open, Priscilla lunged, a kitchen knife gleaming in her hand. Her face was twisted with rage, her voice a scream as she accused him of stealing her son. "You took him!" she shrieked, the words raw and unhinged. "You hid him in your walls!" Lucas reacted on instinct, grabbing her arm and wrenching the knife away. It clattered to the floor, but she kept fighting, her nails clawing at his face. She was frail, easy to overpower, but her screams, wild, incoherent threats, chilled him to the bone. Lucas pinned her down, his hands shaking as he called the police. She thrashed, spitting accusations, her eyes burning with a madness that felt ancient, unstoppable. At one point, she tried to bite him, her teeth snapping inches from his arm. Lucas held her until the police arrived, their sirens a distant wail that grew louder. They restrained her, her screams echoing as they forced her into a cruiser. She never stopped, her voice carrying even as the car disappeared down the street. The police made sure Lucas was okay, their questions clinical but kind. They explained Priscilla would be sent to a psychiatric facility, her behavior suggesting severe mental illness. A search of her house revealed a shrine in her basement, photographs of a young boy, candles, and newspaper clippings about a missing child from decades ago. Her son, they guessed, though the case was cold, the boy long presumed dead. Lucas never saw her again. But the incident left scars. He moved out within a year, unable to shake the memory of her eyes, her knife, or the shrine's flickering candles. The house, once a symbol of his freedom, became a reminder of how fragile safety could be. Even now in a new city, he checks the locks twice, and he never stands on balconies after dark.